Right now on our companion network, C-SPAN 2, we're in the middle of 48 hours of programming about the world of nonfiction books on Book TV. Tomorrow's lineup includes our coverage of New York as Book Country, featuring interviews with authors, book vendors, and a panel discussion on the Rolling Stone Book of Beats. It all begins Sunday at 12 noon on C-SPAN 2's Book TV.
20 years ago, America's cable companies decided, on their own, to provide gavel-to-gavel coverage of Congress as a public service at no cost to the taxpayer. C-SPAN would bring the House, the Senate, democracy as it happens, into our homes and schools. For 20 years, C-SPAN, the cable industry's gift to America.
Now, American Perspectives continues with author and historian Howard Zinn. In August, he appeared at the Wellfleet Public Library near Boston to take questions from the public. They touched on a wide variety of topics, including hate crimes, the two-party system, and the state of education. This event runs about an hour and a half.
Oh, okay. Well, thank you all. I didn't expect that. I mean, I expected an introduction from Ethel Levy, right? She's famous for her eloquent introductions. More than that, though, she's been, a stalwart of Wellfleet and Truro and this Provincetown and this whole area. You probably know that. She and Robert Levy, they've just been rocks in sort of maintaining social consciousness here. Just taking a little bit of time out of people's vacation to make them think. And so they've, right, we don't think the rest of the time. And she's done a terrific job. And of course, we all miss Robert, who was, those of you who know him know, an extraordinary man. He used to sit there in the corner with the earphones recording this for WOMR. So I'm really thankful to her. Thankful also to Elaine McElroy in the library. They make this place available to, I don't know if you make it available to anyone. You must have standards, right? But you sure make it available to all sorts of odd people. Yeah. So, thank you. And as Ethel said, this is a, what do you call it, Ethel? I don't know, a talk-along. Is this like a sing-along? Those things, yeah? And talk-along. Okay. So, does that mean that I should not say anything? No? I should say something. And then you will talk along. Or against. Right? In a spirit, right, of controversy, argument, contention, honest disagreement, right? Of course, I don't want it. But I'll take it. Maybe I'll just start very briefly. I know when a speaker says very briefly, you sort of sink into it, They never mean it, right? But very briefly, just say a few things about what I've been interested in for those of you who, never saw me before, never heard, just wandered in here, because you saw this crowd and the lights and, nothing else to do. So, I've been interested in history for a long time, and I became interested in teaching and writing a different kind of history than I learned in school. I suppose part of it came from my background, a kind of working class background. I don't want to draw too much on your sympathy. Nobody should cry at this point. But yes, and I went to work. I was a shipyard worker at the age of 18. Was working in a shipyard for 3 years. It wasn't a sociological experiment. I just, you know, I had, that's the way it was with my families in our neighborhood and so on. You didn't go to college, you went to work at the age of 18. And I enlisted in the Air Force, and I was a bombardier in the Air Force. A lot of people don't know that. In fact, most people don't know that. In fact, most people don't know anything about me. Most people don't know who I am, you see. But I was in the Air Force. And anyway, when I came out and sort of knocked around for a few years at different jobs and so on, my wife and I, both of us knocked around different jobs. We had kids, and a couple. Sometimes I forget how many. But so I give them a round figure, like a couple. And and then I went to college under the GI Bill, and began to study history in earnest. And then I realized, wow, I had been interested in labor history and labor struggles, and was reading about it on my own. And I didn't see anything in the histories that I was getting in school, or the books that were given to me. I didn't see anything about classes in American history. I thought you could write the history of the United States and use as your very first sentence, the history of this country is a history of class struggle. That's what I thought. But that didn't appear in my books, and that didn't appear in my classes. And it was all as if we were all one big family. This is America. And all the words, all the phrases, all the language was enveloping phrases. All of us together. Exxon and us. You know, the president and us. You know, where it's, you know, the founding fathers, our fathers, right? As if the founding fathers were the fathers of black people, Indians, women, all these rich white, as if the founding fathers were a multicultural group. You know, they weren't. But with all these phrases, you know, the founding fathers, we the people of the United States, first words of the preamble of the Constitution, all enveloping, we're all together, all our interests are the same. And we use those phrases, the national interest. You see that all the time. Is this in the national interest? As if, yeah, our interests are the same as the interests of the Secretary of Defense, right? And no. Or national security, you know. National defense, yes, all of that. All of those words, you know, the things that Kurt Vonnegut called a grand falloon, like a great big bubble to envelop us, you know, but a bubble which needs to be punctured in order to get to the reality inside. And so, I was interested in the absence of the class struggles in American history, which started right from the beginning, right from the very start, right from the very first Europeans who came to these shores, and they weren't all pilgrims with wearing those funny costumes and all equal, riding the Mayflower Compact. I remember it all seemed so democratic. And I wasn't told that there were very, very rich people right from the start, and very poor people, and indentured servants, and slaves, and yeah, I didn't. So I was very interested in writing and teaching a kind of history which would illuminate what I thought was missing, and that was the existence of different class interests all through American history, and how there was a class interest represented in the Founding Fathers and in the Constitution and in all the legislation that followed from that time to this day, legislation which is written on behalf of a particular class, not the poor. Anyway, that's one aspect of my thinking which we can go into or ignore if you want to. But another aspect comes out of my experience in war as a bombardier, and I was in the good war, the best. And yet I came out of that at a certain point thinking war solves no fundamental problem. And that was the best. So you can imagine how I felt about what came afterward. Korea and Vietnam, right? And Grenada and Panama, and Yugoslavia and Iraq, right? So I've been, You know, I came to the conclusion that, yes, war and violence in general doesn't solve fundamental problems. My first teaching job was in Atlanta, Georgia. Taught at a black women's college in Atlanta, Georgia from 1956 to 1963. My wife and I, our kids, living in a black community, becoming involved in the civil rights movement. And that was the biggest learning experience of my life. Learned a lot. Well, one thing, I learned to look at American history from a black point of view, which had never been given to me in graduate school at Columbia. I mean, there weren't even African-American historians on my reading list in graduate school at Columbia up through the PhD, really. I had to discover Du Bois' Black Reconstruction by myself. And I had, as a teaching and living in a black community, to discover the black historians and the black scholars and to learn about that point of view and how everything looked different from a black point of view. And then to extrapolate from that and think how history looked different to Native Americans. You know, the Revolutionary War, wonderful war of independence. Talk about good wars. Who has anything to say against the Revolutionary War? Who's going to stand up for the redcoats? Well, not me. But will I therefore stand up unequivocally for the leaders of the American Revolution? No, not necessarily. From a Native American point of view, the American Revolution was a disaster because it meant that now the British had set a line beyond which the colonists could move westward, and when the American Revolution was won and England was out, that line was gone, and now the colonists were free to move into Indian territory, and they moved and moved and moved and took and annihilated, and, well, you know the story. It's an ugly story. Maybe the most, and I'm going to finish with this, because I figure I could say everything that I know in 15 minutes, you see. The most important thing I learned, I think, from my experience in the South, being involved in the movement in Atlanta, in Albany, Georgia, Selma, Alabama, towns in Mississippi, and all of that. Most important thing I learned, I think, was about democracy. Was about what is the nature of democracy, because it was clear that all those formal institutions of government which had been presented to me in junior high school as democracy, you know, things they put on a blackboard, the three branches of government, executive, legislative, judicial, how neat a formula it was, how proud we were as kids to look at that on the blackboard and say, wow, checks and balances, that's good, you know. And nothing bad can happen, because everybody will check one another if something bad happens. And one of the things you learn in a movement, and especially it was very, very clear in the Southern movement and in the black movement, you could not depend on the formal branches of government. You could not depend on the Constitution. You could not depend on the President or Congress or the Supreme Court to achieve equality. People had to do it themselves, and that's exactly what happened in the South. And black people went out and they demonstrated and they protested and they were beaten and some of them were killed, and they aroused the nation and the world, really, to their situation, and things began to change. And that was democracy. As democracy happens when citizens, democracy doesn't come from the government. Democracy happens when citizens organize and get together and struggle for justice and begin to win things that are needed in order to have a decent society. So that's, I appreciate that enormous burst of applause. And that was planned. I mean, I set her, you know, I set her up too. I don't even know her. Do I? I don't know you, do I? I do. I did set you up. Okay. Anyway, that's all I have to say. So that should give you enough, right? You don't have to ask me or about things that I've spoken about. You can ask me about anything. And I may not know the answer, but you can ask, yes.
What do you read on a daily or weekly or monthly basis that gives you Howard Zinn? that you could depend upon from the media?
What do I read in the media?
Yeah, on a daily basis.
On a daily
or
basis, a weekly basis.
That you
I see.
trust.
What are the periodicals that I trust? How about a list that I don't trust? Yeah, we know that. We know that, right? Yeah. Notice the suspense, because people know they're going to be let in on secret stuff, right? That they never heard of. But it's not secret, no. It's all almost available. I read The Nation. I read In These Times. I read The Progressive. I read Dollars and Cents. How many of you have heard of Dollars and Cents? Yeah. Dollars and Cents are very, very good. It's about economics, but it's about, it puts economics in ways that, well, you know how economics is put in ways that nobody understands. Now, this is something you can understand, and it's very, very good. For Latin American information, I get publications of the North American Council on Latin America, which comes, there are organizations that put out material on special subjects, like the Center for Defense Information will put out stuff on the military budget. The Children's Defense Fund will put things out on the rights of children. And so, yeah, you have to look beyond, obviously, beyond Time and Newsweek, and certainly beyond the front pages of the New York Times. The back pages of the New York Times sometimes give you interesting information. Occasionally something on the front. You have to read it carefully. You have to read the mainstream press carefully. You'll get things in the Wall Street Journal, which nobody will pay attention to you, but you, looking, scrutinizing, will find things in the Wall Street Journal that the Wall Street Journal doesn't want you to notice. So there are, but I found there are things on the internet. Well, I shouldn't say the internet, because I actually don't go into the internet, but everybody talks about the internet, so I thought I should too. Everybody pretends, when they talk about software and hardware and things like that. And I thought, hardware, you go to a store. And, but I do email. My son introduced me to email. And through email, how many of you do email? And I mean, don't be ashamed if you don't do email, but email, I found, is not just a way to communicate with friends and so on. You get unsolicited things through email. You get things from people you never heard of, and you get very interesting stuff. Well, as an example, just 2 days ago, I got an email. Nobody ever heard of. Somebody sent to me something on email, which was a clipping from the Raleigh News and Observer in North Carolina. Now, I'm not a regular subscriber to the Raleigh News and Observer in North Carolina, but here was something clipping, and it was a very interesting thing. It was written by, it was a column, sort of an op-ed piece for the Raleigh News Observer, and written by sort of a man named Stan Goff, who worked for 20 years for the American military in various countries in Latin America and also in Somalia. He worked in Haiti, he worked in Guatemala, he worked in Colombia. And now he's not working for them anymore. And now he can spill the beans. And so he spilled the beans and he said, all this stuff, what is it all about anyway? He said, I know, I was there. He said, oh, it's all about economics, and it's all about business profit. It's all about corporate connections. And it's all covered over with story like in Colombia, we're fighting against the drug war. Well, he knows. He was right involved in that. No, we're not fighting against the drug war. The money that is pouring in supposedly to fight the drug war is really fighting the guerrilla movement in Colombia, and so on. This again and again in country after country. Actually corroborated to a certain extent, talk about the New York Times. There was something in the New York Times the other day, somebody may notice, about Operation Condor, and about how, all this information began to come out about what the United States was doing to train and support paramilitary forces, torturers, and murderers in Latin American countries over a long period of years. So there's, and you have to, I suppose you have to read, I suppose you have to read stuff that, you know, isn't in the mainstream, and and you have to go to the library, you know. And, you know, very often people, young people say, well, what, you know, where can I go for information? I say, and I'm not saying this for you, Elaine. This is not, even though the Wellfleet Library is a terrific resource, not only is it a terrific resource, it will get you books from anywhere. Just talking to somebody tonight, I know you don't believe when I say, I was just reading this the other day. I was just talking to somebody tonight. Think, do I only talk and listen to people so I can have something to say when I get up to speak? Yeah. But I was just talking to somebody tonight who said, a writer, who said she had gotten, you had gotten a whole bunch of stuff for her on a subject she didn't know anything about. You'd gotten it from various libraries and got her this pile of books. Anyway, the library. The library is one of the few places in our culture which is not yet controlled, you know, by corporate wealth and power, and it has a lot of history, and you have to read history. I mean, you won't get history in the newspapers, you won't get history on television. You know, you have to go to the library in order to get history. And if you don't have history, it's as if you were born yesterday. And if you were born yesterday, you will believe anything that some authority tells you. You have no way of checking up on it, you know? The president will get up before the microphone and says, we have to bomb this. Well, sure, of course. The president says so. We must do it, right? He knows. Because you notice how smart presidents have been all through our history. You know, how every time they said we should bomb something, it was absolutely the right thing to do. But if you have no history, if you don't know the history of presidential lying, if you don't know the history of presidential deceptions, if you don't know the history of our wars and the enormous amount, you know, of folderol that accompanied wars, then you might believe. So the library is important. Yes?
The question I have for you is, we've seen, for example, we saw that shooting yesterday in LA. We see that in Boston, the school system, they question this integration. We don't need it anymore. We don't need affirmative action. How do you explain that in a time when we know it's a joke, but it appears we have economic affluence, which you all know doesn't really trickle down, why are people responding in this hate mannerisms? How do you interpret history, you know, an explanation? Because it appears that everything should be, that people should be common and understand and be more tolerant, although we understand they're really not. But how do you know, what's your interpretation?
You mean people should be calmer because the country is prosperous?
Well, no, I don't believe that. What I'm asking you is, why, no.
Oh, well.
It appears that, as you said, our president
then
says,
you really know. Then you know that behind the appearance of prosperity is an awful lot.
I agree with you, but I want
so then, you want me to say it? You know it. Yes. You think people will believe it more if I say it than if you say it. You know, very often questioners know more than you do about something, you see. And so what happens is they pretend they don't know a lot about this subject. And then you pretend you know a lot about this subject. So based on this double pretense, you have a very nice question and answer period. You see. But as you know, there's a lot of alienation in this country, right? And a lot of distress and a lot of envy. I mean, how can you not have envy and distress and neurosis when we have this enormous gap between the very rich and the very poor, a growing gap, and where we're beset, the whole culture beset with images of people living fantastic luxury, and other people, not just people in down below, but people in the middle classes struggling to keep their jobs, struggling to pay their kids' tuition. Well, even somebody who invests in stocks, right? Like that guy, right, who went berserk, the stock speculator, right? I mean, it's a very insecure kind of economic system we live under. Insecure, as I say, not just for the poor, but for the middle classes. And And it's a situation where, well, as you know, this so-called prosperity, I mean, the president gets up there and he's glowing over with how wonderful, what an economic boom. And you know, all you have to do is walk through a city. Walk through a city, walk from one end of a city to the next, and you will see the class system in every city in this country. You will see people living very, very nicely, and you will see places and cities that look as if they've been through a war. And you know that the people who live in those places cannot possibly feel good about the world and about the society. And so much of this gets deflected into racial hatred, you know, and people look for somebody to attack. And I guess I have to say something else about this. You know, whenever these incidents happen, and they happen so often, right? These shootings and these people going berserk in schoolhouses and post offices, and you know, and everybody gets very indignant, and everybody asks, you know, why and what shall we do about this, and how can we pinpoint these people? They always ask, you know, how can we get a psychological profile of these people so we will know in advance who they are, you see, and what will you do then? You see, because all of these people, after they do this, their neighbors all say, a really nice guy, you know, really, didn't give me any trouble. Yes, but I want to say one more thing about that, and that is, you know, here we live in a culture in which the United States government possesses enormous weapons of violence and uses them, and then gets excited and indignant when some, you know, half-mad person goes berserk. You see, these people in Washington, they're not half-mad, right? Or are they? You see, wholly mad. I don't know, the definitions of madness, you know, are very, very strange. You know, somebody's mad if he just goes into a schoolroom and sprays people with bullets, but the President of the United States and Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense, and all those people up there are not mad when they drop cluster bombs that tear the legs off children. That's not, you know, they're not. When you live in a culture like that, and then what do you expect? So, you know, I think that's something we ought to think about if we want to start addressing, you know, the issue of violence. Yes.
What's wrong with a compassionate plutocracy?
A compassionate plutocracy. Show me one. You know, plutocracy means the people who have the wealth, right? It's not an aristocracy, which is people who are better, right? But plutocracy, people who have the wealth, are going to be benign and run. No, even Plato, who wanted a platocracy, no. Even Plato, thought no. The people who run, and his wasn't a democracy, but he thought the people who run the thing should not have a lot of wealth. You see, even he understood that. You can't give people, no, forget it. Besides, we have a plutocracy, only it's not benevolent, right? And can't really expect those people to be benevolent until they're absolutely forced to. And that's what happens in history. Yes.
We've had a lot of experiments in government before Christ in ancient Greece and ancient Crete. And I'm wondering, I just finished reading Will and Ariel Durant's series of the story of civilization. And I'm wondering if those lessons of government are irrelevant to us today because of the size of our population and also the fact that we have the kinds of weaponry, our governments have the kind of weaponry that we do. What do you think about that?
I don't think anything in the past is irrelevant. That is, I think, we always can learn from the past. It's a question of whether you just, take, sort of mechanically things out of the past and plant them onto the present, or will you take selectively from the experience of the past, you know. And we can learn things from ancient Greece. We'll learn, for one thing, that you can't call a place a democracy if most of the people are either slaves or women out of it, or, you know, people who don't have any power. It's not a democracy just because you've extended, you know, power to 500 people instead of everybody, you know, in the society. And you can learn a lot from ancient society. I mean, you can learn that you can have a society that is more liberal than any other. Like, you know, Athens was more liberal than Sparta, right? And so you can more democratic than Sparta. And so you can learn a lot about that, because Athens is more democratic than Sparta, but when they get involved in the Peloponnesian War,